But anyway, they claim to represent some mass organization, some mass movement. Vegans can never claim that. I mean, in 2016, do we represent 1% of the population? Do we represent 2% of the population? Why would violence be justified or effective on behalf of that 2% of the population?
À-bas-le-ciel.
So, this kind of irrelevant radicalism, totally counterproductive radicalism that can't help you with ecology, can't help you with political organization, can't help you with any of the type of community organizations I've been talking about. And it's a way of thinking about social change that, because it is rooted in violence and its ultimate objectives are violence and its means are violence, it never thinks through the type of examples you guys have heard me talk about 10 times on this channel. What about cigarette smoking and how cigarette smoking has changed society? What about social organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, really effective non-party forms of activism? When I was in the Green Party even, I was just trying to talk to them about publications, about having a magazine that talked about ecology and the science of ecology and, social change in relation to that. You just had a magazine gathering together bits of news that people who donate money to the Green Party would care about, and talking about that stuff in an authentic way that would mean so much, and it would justify people donating money to you. Ecology has a scientific aspect as well as an ethical aspect, as well as a vegan aspect. If you had a magazine addressing those things instead of phony threats of violence and revolution, it would make such a positive difference. And this is in Canada. Jesus Christ. You want to talk about resorting to violence here in Canada. Have you been to City Hall? No, none of these people have been to City Hall. They've never been to Parliament. They've never tried the legal means of making a difference. And when I did that stuff, when I was nobody, when I was a young kid in university going to City Hall, I met and spoke with some of the most powerful people in Canadian politics long term. I interacted with two different guys who later became heads of the NDP, of our Democrat Party. I had an image I used to post all the time that related to my experience in Cambodia, showing the devastation of revolution in Cambodia, with a quote saying, there's no room to be a fake dress-up revolutionary when there's a real revolution going on. But these people who preach violence, they both lack a pragmatic connection to meaningful politics and to thoughts about how political change actually happens, how to really make political change happen. And they also have avoided learning lessons from history. They've avoided reading about actual revolutions, what really happens with real class warfare, with real violence when it goes on. So this remains something glorified and abstract in their minds, which is sickening to me. Something people on the left wing say all the time, and I understand, believe me, I have studied the Vietnam War, especially with reference to Laos, Cambodia, etc. I've studied the Vietnam War, but people on the left talk all the time about learning the lessons of Vietnam. Yeah, well, why don't Jesus Christ, there are a lot of lessons to learn from Vietnam. There are lessons to learn from the real communist revolutions, political revolutions that have happened in Vietnam, in Russia, in China, in Cambodia. God damn. But as crazy as communism is, one thing you can say in its favor is at least they pretend to represent a large class in society. Like the Bolsheviks in Russia, they didn't even claim to represent the majority, but they could say, well, about 25% of Russians are members of this industrial poor class that they represent. So they could say they represented 25% of the population. In reality, would that 25% even vote for them if they had an election? That's another story. But, communists in different countries can claim to represent 25% or 50% of the population. Sometimes they claim to represent the poor. Now in Canada, what percentage of the population are really poor, right? These are the problems you get into. But anyway, they claim to represent some mass organization, some mass movement. Vegans can never claim that. I mean, in 2016, do we represent 1% of the population? Do we represent 2% of the population? Why would violence be justified or effective on behalf of that 2% of the population? This is mimicking a mentality that is from the 18th century in Europe, not even the 19th century, of assuming that political radicalism, simply by declaring itself radical, represents a huge class of oppressed people. And if those oppressed people are just given leadership, violent leadership, then they will suddenly rise up and vindicate your movement. And this is, of course, a very biased allusion to the experience of the French Revolution, especially. Really, I don't even mean one French Revolution. I mean several French revolutions, none of them being really studied or thought about critically. God, yeah, look at the French Revolution. What was the outcome? Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon reestablished slavery. You want to talk about learning the lessons from Vietnam? You want to talk about learning the lessons of history? You want to talk about learning the lessons of these revolutions? Why don't you actually study what happened in those revolutions? The total disaster, the loss of life on a scale unbelievable, and the outcome being establishing a dictatorship so horrible you yourself would not want to live through it. And that was true of the French Revolution, singular, or revolutions plural, the revolution in China. God damn, take a look at what communism actually did in Vietnam. Once you get past the kind of phony narrative of looking at Vietnam as the victim of American aggression, which of course it is. American bombardment is very real, but communist dictatorship is very real also. Mass murder by communist dictatorships. Jesus, and murder during the revolution itself, and what class warfare really means. There are a lot of lessons to learn from the Vietnam War, or from all of these wars, or from the stupidity of this pro-war, social war attitude. All right, guys, that is what it is. Let's end this video there. I've talked to you guys from about 6:30 a.m. till after 7 a.m. here in Canada. As mentioned, this is what I look like when I'm completely exhausted. No makeup, no intro, no outro, real talk. These are the issues I've dealt with my whole life. I wish it was a joke. I wish I could say that these types of extreme politics were not an issue in Canada. God, you'd think, you'd think the streets run red with blood in Canada, but they are. And violence and nonviolence, in theory and in practice, remain profoundly important fundamental issues for vegans to be able to get to grips with. And again, why is that? It's not just because violence is a means to an end, but violence shapes the end, shapes the objective so profoundly of what you're trying to do that it pollutes or it distorts all of the stages leading up to that. So the Green Party, using the same example, when I was there, they were not even thinking about having a magazine that talked about science, like science news, new scientific stuff in relation to ecology. Even though it was so obvious, like if you're doing fundraising, you want people to donate money to you because you're an ecological movement, the type of people who donate money, they will really value a magazine that comes out every 3 months telling you about recent events, within Canada, but recent scientific discoveries, recent research related to ecology, related to pollution in some river, or that's what those people want to read about. But that was a shockingly new idea, a shockingly original idea to people inside the Green Party when I presented to them. Not because they're stupid, or some of them are stupid, but they do not think in those terms at all, because the paradigm of violent revolution, the paradigm, that outcome, thinking in those terms, means they're not thinking about the really constructive methods of how to build a constituency, of how to build an effective movement. And when I first started talking about cigarette smoking and government attempts to discourage nicotine and social activist movements in relation to nicotine and alcohol, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, cigarette smoking, when I started talking about that on YouTube, many vegans wrote into me and said, wow, that's a shockingly original idea. They'd never thought of those comparisons. Why? Again, not because they're stupid, although stupidity is real. Many of the people involved are stupid. They had never thought of those things because the paradigm of violence, this objective, these methods, so distort the discourse, so direct your attention away from really salient considerations of effective activism, of how do we organize a movement, what are our methods, what are our means, what are our outcomes. So again, ecology pure and simple and veganism. God, communism has been one of the most influential ideologies in the history of the world. It's a huge problem in terms of how it distorts the way vegans think about changing the world. It's an even bigger problem if you were involved in labor activism, like labor unions trying to help workers' rights or raise wages or what have you. So there are many deep, unexamined assumptions about how we pursue social change that comes out of the last 200 years of experience with communism and radicalism. And I can't say it's irrelevant to all circumstances in the world in 2016. You know, there are extreme circumstances. There's Somalia, there's, Saudi Arabia. There are all kinds of really extreme political circumstances around the world where maybe we'd be having a totally different conversation. But yeah, in these white, Western, decadent, democratic contexts, it is shameful to me. It is shameful to me that vegans want to be phony, dress-up revolutionaries. And I say shame on you. You guys have already seen my videos. Shame on Gary Yourofsky for taking the platform he had to advocate positive social change and polluting it with a pro-violence message.